The Hardys had more money than the Warners, and they didn't mind letting people know it. They had a formal ballroom that filled the whole second floor in the right wing of the house, and had its own set of stairs beside another set that led to the musicians' gallery, out of sight of the guests, but still in hearing. There was no clearing of furniture or removing of partitions between rooms in this house. Nothing need be makeshift. And Mrs. Hardy greeted everyone at the foot of the ballroom stairs, even though she had seen and spoken to them at dinner, which was, incidentally, a full-course affair. None of this outlandish buffet style where everyone served himself. That was so continental, and everyone knew continentals had such poor taste. Oh yes, their art was exquisite. Mrs. Hardy had some new pieces only recently sent over, and everyone must come see them. But their manners were atrocious. Mrs. Hardy had even hoped Teague would enjoy the dancing, before she remembered, and apologized profusely enough to make the people behind him in the receiving line blush. He had simply mumbled something about preferring the parlor, and moved on. They were the kind of people Anderson Scott might call show ponies fed on chaff. Teague smiled at his father's distinctive turn of phrase as he watched Matthew Hardy debate some point or other with a man who was said to be a close friend of the governor's first cousin. Hardy had an amusing tendency to utter some pithy statement to summarize other people's arguments, then sit back quickly in his chair as if to get away from the brilliance of his words, lest he be blinded by it. He had the definitive explanation for everything, and Teague got the feeling that he was quite the bully in discussion groups at school. "What of this business of raising Negro regiments?" asked the governor's cousin's friend, Mr. Smith. "What a question!" Matthew laughed. "Certainly you know it will all come to nothing. A Negro man hasn't the intelligence necessary to learn commands and drill formations. Any officer in command of such a regiment would, I dare say, give it up for lost in under a month." "But surely you must agree that if this is to be a war to abolish slavery, those who would benefit most from it ought to be able to fight on their own behalf," Ralph Hardy said from his place at the parlor door. "I surely do not," Matthew answered his brother, younger only by a year, as though he were indulging a child by letting him in the conversation. Teague couldn't have been less surprised by the response. This parlor might have been an ideal place for a nap, if not for Matthew's incessant prattle, and Teague definitely wanted a nap. "I say, Captain Scott!" Teague heard his name being called in a tone indicating a second or third attempt. "I apologize, Mr. Hardy. I was listening to a favorite strain upstairs. You were saying?" "I asked whether you thought Negroes capable of soldiering." Matthew turned to Mr. Smith. "Captain Scott is a Southerner, you know, and no doubt he is infinitely better acquainted with them than we are." "I think a Negro as capable as the next man." "Indeed." Hardy sat forward in his chair. "Even though, as a rule, they are illiterate and uneducated?" "You don't have to be literate to load a gun, Mr. Hardy. Soldiers don't read bullets." Ralph and a few other men chuckled, but Matthew was unflustered. "You miss the point entirely, then, sir. It is precisely that to which I object. Do you not see the danger of giving live ammunition to ignorant innocents? Who knows what harm they may inflict on themselves? It would be like giving guns to babies." Matthew sat back in his chair quickly. Teague smiled. "When I was a boy, I had a slave who once took a squirrel's head off at 100 yards. He laughed. "On a windy day. Can you do that?" Matthew was silent. "Neither can I." "Well, you must concede that man was an exception," Mr. Smith said. "Oh, yes, Henry was exceptional." Matthew turned away and renewed his conversation with Mr. Smith. Teague figured he need not converse with Matthew Hardy any more that night, and being in such a happy condition, he could lean his head back on the sofa and attempt to sleep. Etiquette be hanged. Teague opened his eyes when he felt the weight of someone sitting beside him. Annalee always managed to find him when he didn't want to be found. He certainly couldn't sleep now. No, conversation be hanged with etiquette. "How goes it in the men's club?" she asked. Well enough. He leaned his head back again. Do you not feel well? Well enough. Annalie opened her fan and waved it before her face. I had to get out of the ballroom. It's sweltering. She glanced at him from the corner of her eyes. Fanny Miller actually swooned. Sam had to cut her laces. Teague made no response except to shift his position a bit to make the headrest more comfortable. Annalie turned her fan on him. Aren't you hot? Well enough. Well enough. Annalie fanned herself again. Teague did feel well enough as he closed his eyes. Proud, actually, that he'd managed to quell not one, but 2 attempts at conversation that night. Perhaps he could snore if he fell asleep. That would end the evening perfectly. Did you see that lightning? Teague turned to Aubrey and nodded. A double strike. He couldn't feel the rain running down his back anymore. His shirt and jacket were sticking too close to his skin for that. He felt only the cold linen wrinkling up against him and the wet wool pants chafing his thighs. He'd lost his forage cap in the last battle, and water trailed from the long hair hanging down his forehead into his eyes. He swept it out of his face every other minute, but the wind was blowing, so the straggling waves of his hair only clung more furiously to his cheeks and forehead. He was marching beside the column. Marching wasn't really the appropriate word, as he and the rest of the regiment were fighting with the mud for possession of their shoes. Teague lost that battle and bent down to retrieve his shoe. The sound of breaking suction was augmented by the percussion of flint hitting a cap and the dull thud of a bullet lodging in flesh as the private standing beside Teague staggered and fell into the puddle made by the rut in the road. Teague didn't even look at the man, but yelled out, "Snipers!" a second before Captain Hudson called for the company to take up a defensive position. Teague jumped the fence alongside the road and fell on his back when his stockinged right foot slid forward in the mud. He saw the shoe still in his hand, threw it down, and crawled through the line of men forming on the ground behind the fence. They lay on their backs, loading their powder as quickly as possible to keep it from getting wet. What imbecile Confederate was trying to fight in the rain? A crack of lightning hitting a tree carried over the sniper's volley, and the ground shook with the simultaneous thunder. "Fire at will!" Teague screamed it to his platoon, even though he didn't know where the snipers were. He felt at his hip, but he'd lost his pistol in the last battle too. The line was taking too long to load, even if it was raining. "Fire! Fire!" he screamed again as blood spattered on his face from the minie-ball that tore a 2-inch hole in his neighbor's hand after he had raised it too high and thrusting the ramrod down his barrel. Teague smeared the blood when he tried to wipe it off, but the rain was washing it away for him. Another man lay his musket between the rails of the fence and tried to take aim through the smoke, but his musket misfired, and he fell back against Teague with his hair smoking from the flame that had shot into his face. A mass of powder had burned into the man's eye, and the rain pouring over his face ran black from the socket. Teague opened his eyes and looked around the parlor. All the people seemed engrossed in their own conversations, and no one was looking at him. He could only assume he had not acted out his dream. Annalie wasn't sitting beside him anymore. That was good for her. She was talking with Sam Etheridge now. "This party gets duller by the minute," Matthew Hardy said to no one in particular. The other conversation ceased. "Wonder where the Brightons are. They're always quite the spectacle." "Mrs. Brighton is in mourning for her brother, Matthew," Annalie reminded him. "Oh." Matthew glanced over to Mr. Smith. "I see." He shifted in his chair. "Well, that's a shame. That's a real shame." Dr. Warner looked into the parlor as he passed with a group of older people behind Mrs. Hardy. Teague stood to follow him. "Perhaps Captain Scott would be so good as to liven our party with a story," Mr. Smith suggested. "Some of his exploits, maybe." Teague stared at the man, and noted that even Matthew had the decency to stare as well. "No." "Come now, you must have some experience with heroics. How else would you—" He looked to the stump quickly, then back to Teague's face. Teague was silent for several moments. His throat was too tight for any words, until he winced and involuntarily swallowed at the remembrance of a scream cut off by frothy gurgling. His throat opened enough for what seemed like a whisper to Teague's ears, but an audible one to the rest of the people in the room. "But if the cause be not good, the king himself hath a heavy reckoning to make, when all those legs and arms and heads chopped off in a battle shall join together at the latter day and cry all, 'We died at such a place.'" Teague caught his breath. "Some swearing, some crying for a surgeon, some upon their wives left poor behind them, some upon the debts they owe, some upon their children rawly left." He ground his teeth and felt his head shaking from the pressure of it. He squeezed his eyes shut to rid them of the tears that were blurring his sight. "I am afeard there are few die well that die in a battle. For how can they charitably dispose of anything when the blood is their argument?" He stood still before them and wiped his nose with his hand before he left the parlor. By the time Annalee followed him out of the house, as he knew she would, Teague had cleaned his face a bit. He turned to her as she came near. "If you say one word about God—" "Why? Why should I have to censor myself around you like God is some kind of filthy word? I think I do a creditable enough job of censoring already, thank you very much, without having to take out all mention of God."
"You might have fooled me."
"What is wrong with you? You act like you're the only person who's ever felt pain. Well, you're not. You don't have to quote Shakespeare to us to prove what this country is going through or what you've gone through or whatever it is you're trying to prove. Yes, I agree, the man's excusable, but couldn't you at least attempt to be civil?"
"I just hate being around people who talk too much."
"Then why don't you leave?" He looked at her face, and her eyes did not lose their hardness. He fingered the sleeves of Tom's suit.
"Because I can't afford to."
"That's not what I meant, and you know it." They both looked to the road where some rider was killing a horse in his urgency. It was the telegrapher's boy, and he didn't bother to tie the horse when he reached the house, but instead ran straight for the door. Annalee called to him as he went past. "What's wrong?"
"Rebs are in Ohio."